I want you to, I want everybody to listen for something and just look all around them and take everything in as we do this. We're going to walk into Adventureland. But you know, I said earlier about Disneyland being a movie. In a movie you have things like, well, often you have straight cuts, but also you have these kind of split edits that have sound that goes from one scene into the next, yeah? And you sometimes have cross dissolves. Disneyland is full of live action cross dissolves. You don't think about it, but they're there. In every context they are there. As we walk here, you will notice, if you look at the greenery on Main Street is all very manicured. It's, you know, nice mowed lawns and all the rest of it. As you walk into Adventureland, you'll see suddenly the greenery becomes wild. You have trees growing everywhere. The floor on Main Street, the pavement on Main Street is pristine. It's cobbled. We've already started the cross dissolve. As we walk up here out of Main Street into Adventureland, we start to see that the pavement starts to get a little bit rougher. Also the sound. You hear this sound, you hear this music on Main Street. And this is almost like magic, because, you know, it's Disney magic. As you walk across the bridge into Adventureland, listen for the way that the sound cross dissolves. You hear the Main Street music dip down and you hear the environment music for Adventureland come up. Just walk across and just listen and look as you're doing it. Like right here you can still hear Main Street. You can't hear anything of Adventureland. The pavement is starting to turn into, you've got this like little barrier here. Notice what happens when you come across this barrier. You stop hearing Main Street and you start hearing Adventureland. It's like magic. It is magic. If you guys turn around, you see that tree that is sticking out right above all the others? There's a big palm tree there, yeah? That's called the Dominguez tree. That's the oldest thing in Disneyland. And it was planted in 1895. And before Disneyland was Disneyland, all around here, interestingly, both here and in Florida, it was orange groves. They're both Orange County. But it was farmland, and this was a farm, this parcel of land was a farm owned by the Dominguez family. And that tree was given to Ma and Pa Dominguez as a wedding present in 1895. And when they sold the land to Disney, they did so with one condition. They said to Walt Disney, you can only have the land if you promise to keep the tree. So they built Disneyland around it, that tree, which is kind of amazing. And this shows you a sense that although Disney has become a giant kind of corporate entity, there is still a kind of respect for the past, and there is a reverence for anything that connected back to Walt. And they could so easily have taken that tree down at various points. If you look at the Indiana Jones ride, it's built around it. The whole thing is built around the tree because that tree is kind of sacred, is sacrosanct. And that's a nice story in and of itself. But here's an even better one. Do you remember the name of the guy I told you to remember on Main Street? Ron Dominguez was the son of those people. He started here, he worked as a Jungle Cruise skipper. He ended up as vice president of Disneyland Parks, and basically, his whole career was at Disney. He worked, and do you remember the little thing that said something about looking after the land as if it were your own? Because it was his own. It was his family's land. So that whole window on Main Street reflects back on the fact that it was on the land that his family grew up on. And actually, for many, many years, backstage, they had offices in the kind of bungalows that contained the offices was the farmhouse of the Dominguez family. It was still there. It's gone now, but it was there for many, many years. So yeah, just goes to show. Oh, actually, stop! Before we get here, I want to tell you something else. I'll go back to my little stage. I've just remembered something else. I knew this would happen. So, back in 1954, when they were building Disneyland, they bought out, and those people who do the Disney thing will have heard me read it, a little golden book called The Little Man of Disneyland, which tells the story of Patrick Begorra, who was the last leprechaun in Hollywood, who Mickey, Donald and Goofy come to scout this land. And he says, you can't build, I'm not going to do the accents here, but he says, you can't build this. He says, you can't build here, this is where my house is. And they take him in a helicopter to the Disney studio in Burbank and explain to him what they're going to build, this amazing place called Disneyland. And he says to them, okay, you can do it, but only on one condition. You've got to let me find another house somewhere in Disneyland. And they say to him, well, we'll build you another house. And at the end of the book, it says, no, I don't want you to build me another house. And he just disappears one night. And nobody knows where Patrick Bagora's house is in Disneyland. Except perhaps maybe one day you'll be able to discover it. Come with me. So I just asked the people who were here, who got here first, I asked them to listen carefully. Can you hear that clicking sound?
Yeah.
Does anybody here speak fluent Morse code? Because if you did, what you would be hearing is, have a guess, what would you be hearing? No.
Train in something minutes.
No.
Welcome to Disneyland.
No. To all who come to this happy place, welcome. Here age relives fond memories of the past. Here youth savours the promise of tomorrow. It's Walt Disney's opening day speech in Morse code at the station. That is the little detail. That's what I mean when I say that this place is about little details. Because who on earth knows that? I do. And now you do. So there you go. So we are now standing in an area that doesn't exist in any of the other parks, called New Orleans Square. It was the first addition to Disneyland, the first major land that was built on to Disneyland. And it also has a kind of sadness to it in some ways, because it's also the first part of Disneyland that was opened after Walt Disney died. It opened in 1967. Walt Disney died in 1966, 15th of December 1966 to be precise. Just to lay one old chestnut to bed, Walt Disney is not frozen. He is not. His head has not been frozen. He has not been. I've heard in the past that Walt Disney is frozen and inside the statue that is on at the end of Main Street. Considering that statue didn't go up until like the 1980s and Walt Disney died in 66, that's extremely unlikely. He's not in a time capsule underneath the castle, he's not in any of that thing. He died, he was cremated, and his ashes were scattered in Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Burbank. I can confirm, I can't confirm that the ashes are there because I didn't see them scattered, but I can confirm that his grave's there because I've been there. I think one of the reasons why this rumour sprang up was because Walt was kind of interested in all sorts of new technologies. So it stands to reason that at some point he may well have looked at cryogenics, which was emerging in the 1960s. Also, people say, well, nobody ever saw his funeral. He didn't have a big public funeral. He was actually, bizarrely for somebody who became such a public figure, he was a relatively private man. He had a funeral for his family. He hasn't got a big monument. If you go to Forest Lawn Memorial Park, you really have to know where Walt Disney's grave is in order to see it. It's a tiny little plaque in a very quiet little memorial garden. It isn't a big statue. It isn't a giant monument. I like to think that if you're looking for a monument to Walt Disney, you're standing in it.